Chapter 1, Late Season Run. The Sevmorput left Murmansk in a hurry that pretended to be routine. In the Portum's sodium glare, the ship looked like a long, ugly certainty square shoulders of steel, blunt bow built to bully ice, cranes folded like knuckles. Men in quilted jackets moved like punctuation on the quay, small against the hull. Containers slid into place with the ordinary violence of cargo work, and the manifests were the ordinary story of the Arctic: calories, bandages, bolts, bottled gas. The kind of dull supply that kept lights on in outposts that pretended not to be lonely. Only one container looked new enough to argue with the rest of the deck. It was painted a clean, stubborn white and stenciled with a code no one on the dock could read at a glance. Ash Alebi moduli gradually keep. Dry Iran in block letters along the side. The cargo master, Pavel Tikhonov, stood with his tablet tucked under his arm and watched it settle into a corner of the upper hold as if it were a misbehaving animal. What is in it? Anya Kuznetsova asked, because she was young enough to keep asking questions on a ship full of people who had learned that curiosity came with paperwork. Pavel glanced at her, then at the container, then down at his screen. "Ada money," he said. "Ada number whatcha," he said. "Ada number wantas. Ada number rest." Anya was an electrician by training and a notebook hoarder by habit. She wrote down small things that were easy to forget: numbers on breaker panels, odd smells, names of spare parts that mattered later. She also wrote down moods, because moods made people stupid and stupid people started fires. The Sevmorput had no room for fire. On the bridge, Captain Viktor Sokolov looked at the ice charts as if he could stare a late freeze back into the sea. The satellite imagery was streaked with early gray. The forecast graphs on the screen were the same shape as they had been yesterday and the day before: wind shifting, temperature dropping, the pack thickening in all the places where it was inconvenient. "Winter, late already, Al, you," came the voice from shore operations through the speaker, tinny and impatient. "All later stations have one more barge before winter. If we miss this window, they miss a season. You understand that, all you." Sokolov understood what a "you understand" meant. It meant there would be no language later in any report that blamed anyone above him. It meant his name would be the place where the chain of responsibility stopped. He set his jaw so hard the skin whitened at the edges. "Oh, we will make checkpoint in 3 days," he said. "Oh, why no delays? No delays." Chief Engineer Elena Baranova was on the bridge for the departure, hands behind her back, eyes on the gauges that pretended everything was stable. She was the sort of person who looked like she belonged anywhere machinery existed. She didn't argue with the captain in front of shore operations. She waited until the line went quiet. "No delays," she said mildly, as if tasting the phrase. "A sea doesn't know our schedule. Know our schedule." Sokolov didn't look away from the ice charts. "Aye, the sea does not have to pay for our fuel either. Yuan." Elena's mouth twitched. It was not a smile. "The sea is excellent at collecting payment. Yuan." Below decks, the ship assigns internal life settled into its familiar rhythm. The constant hum of ventilation, the footfalls that never stopped, the low background argument of pumps. People told jokes that had been old in Murmansk, old in Leningrad, old in 100 half-lit mess rooms. The cook, Nadia, made stew thick enough to make the men forget the thinness of the world outside for an hour. Anya ate with her coworkers at a table bolted to the deck. The talk turned, as it always did when men pretended not to be afraid, to the ice. "Early this year," said Misha Orlov, one of the bosuns, "a diver when the ship needed one and a problem when it didn't. He had a scar on his hand from some previous mistake, and he kept tapping it against his cup as if to remind himself it was still there. Olva, the ice doesn't care what the calendars say." "The ice never cared," Man someone answered. "The ice is a god. You just learn its moods. Are you not?" Anya listened and watched the steam from her food curl and vanish. She shan't grown up with winter that bit. The Arctic was a different animal. Winter there was not cold, it was the absence of mercy. 2 days out, the horizon disappeared. It started as a familiar whitening, sea and sky blending into one bad photograph, the line between them erased. Then wind came, sudden and intimate, working its way under every collar. Snow didn't fall so much as arrive from all directions. The bow shouldered aside small floes with a shuddering crunch, the sound of 1,000 plates breaking under the Shipazaya's weight. On the bridge, the world outside turned into a screen of moving white. Radar gave shapes that might have been ice or might have been lies. Sonar came back messy, cluttered with noise, as if the sea itself had turned restless. "Pack closing," the watch officer said, and his voice did not rise, because raising the voice at ice was a waste. Sokolovashin's fingers tightened around the edge of the chart table. "As we hold course." Elena glanced at him. The corridor is narrowing. Not non." "We have an icebreaker," Sokolov said, "and a schedule, and a schedule." In the hold, Pavel listened to the Shipazal's tone change. You could feel it, if you lived on steel long enough, the shift from forward motion to strain. The Dekazal's vibration grew harsher, like a man gritting his teeth. Anya felt it too. She put down her spoon, suddenly unable to swallow, and imagined the ship from the outside, a long red line trying to draw itself through a white paper that would rather not be marked. In her notebook, under a list of fuses she meant to order when they got back, she wrote one sentence. Ice is not water you can argue with. Chapter 2, The Corridor. The ice waited until the ship committed. They were threading a corridor between two pressure ridges that rose like frozen waves, slabs shoved up by forces that had no patience. The ridges looked slow. Everything in ice looked slow, from the safe distance of the bridge window. But Elena had watched ridges being born before. She knew what oscillate meant. It meant pressure building invisibly until the movement happened, and then Steele discovered the difference between motion and momentum. Windages shifted to Senshin, the watch officer said, reading off the instruments. Current to currentin. The sentence broke under the sound of a deep, almost thoughtful groan that came up through the deck plates. The corridor tightened. The ridges did not move so much as decide to occupy more space. The Sev Morbitas's bow pushed forward, and the ship answered in the language it knew, engine pitch rising, hull shuddering, ice cracking like rifle fire. Somewhere below, a wrench fell off a shelf and hit the deck with a lonely clang. Anya, in the electrical workshop, looked up as if someone had called her name. On the bridge, Sokolov leaned closer to the glass, though there was nothing to see but white. "ID maintain speed," he said. Elena's hand hovered over the intercom. She didn't speak into it yet. She waited, listening. The ship had a heartbeat, too, a cycle of vibrations that told you whether she was moving cleanly or fighting. The heartbeat stumbled. There was a scrape, not loud, but sickeningly intimate, as if the ship had dragged her belly along rock. It wasn't the high, bright sound of ice. It was duller, final. The engine note changed again. Sokolovich's face drained. I'll stop, he said. Too late. All's reverse, reverse. The Sevmorput tried. The propellers bit, and the whole hull trembled. For a moment, there was but a shiver of movement backward, a loosening ink. Then the ice behind them closed like a hand. The ridges continued their slow-motion bulldozer work, squeezing the corridor until the ship was no longer a line through paper, but a wedge forced into a crack that did not want it. The hull took the pressure and complained. Steele complained politely, at first, creaks that could be ignored, pops that might have been ice shifting, then it stopped being polite. Up on the superstructure, something tore away with a shriek that cut through even the wind. An antenna, then another. The SATCOM dome, a white bubble that had always seemed permanent, ripped loose and vanished into the storm like a thrown skull. When a was losing topside gear, the watch officer said, voice tight. Secure it, Sokolov snapped, as if anyone could secure something that ice was ripping off with patient strength. Below, alarms began to stutter in the machinery spaces, first one, then a chorus. The Shipason's internal speakers crackled with voices that were trying not to panic. Machinery to bridge, Alice, tame a breathless call, engine re have a breach, water ingress, starboard side, low. Machinery space 3. Elenaya's hand finally hit the intercom. All hands watertight integrity. Close doors on my mark, and she said, and her voice was calm in a way that made men obey. Asha pumps to full. Report compartments. The Sevmorput had been designed for violence ice breaking, collisions with flows, the casual abuse of cold. But designs made on paper always assumed the world would behave within the margins. The crack that opened low on the hull didn't care what anyone assumed. Anya ran down the corridor, boots slipping on a deck that had suddenly grown wet with condensation and fear. Emergency lighting flickered, not yet failing, but considering it. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like a storm trapped inside. At the watertight door to her section, she found Dr. Andrei Petrov already there, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair plastered by sweat despite the cold. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. You have a job? He asked. Electrical, she said, panting. Then do it, Tatsamani said. And Damandi die in the corridor, Tatsamani. The door-sen's wheel was cold under her hands. She spun it with practiced speed, locking herself into the compartment with 3 other people, 2 electricians, and a machinist whose face was gray. Over the ship's comms, Elena's voice counted down, Elena closing on mark, 3, 2, 1. The watertight door slammed shut in sequence, the sound like a series of heavy decisions. The ship shrank into a set of sealed boxes, each containing air and people and whatever luck they had. For a while, it was controlled ugly but manageable, like Elena would later say. Pumps hammered, men hauled hoses through corridors that slanted slightly as the ship took on water. Counterflooding orders came from the bridge, making the ship heavier on purpose to keep her from rolling over in the squeeze. Anya worked with her hands in a cabinet, fingers numb, flipping breakers and rerouting power to keep the pump sped. The lights flickered, returned, flickered again. The ship's life became a stuttering thing. Then the second shove came. No one saw it. They felt it as a sudden, brutal change in the pressure of the world. The hull groaned loud enough to be heard through closed bulkheads. Somewhere, a structural member gave up. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the Shipazon's bones. The compartment beneath them in machinery space, or maybe the adjacent void-off, failed. The flooding that had been contained by doors and pumps found a new path, spilling into another section with the indifferent enthusiasm of water obeying gravity. Anya Asa's lights went out for a full second. In the dark, someone screamed a name. Then, emergency lighting came on, dim and red, and the world returned in the color of blood. On the bridge, Sokolov felt the deck tilt under his feet. The instruments danced. A klaxon rose and stayed. On a panel, a light labeled REHEATOR scram flashed, then held steady. Elena stared at it, a small part of her relieved. The scram was the ship protecting itself. It was also a door closing. "Reactor is down now, CE," the watch officer said, as if announcing a death. "Good," Elena said, because sometimes she said good even when you meant impossible. The Sev Morput settled. The tilt increased. Loose items slid. Cabinets banged open. The Shipinance's internal noises on fans, pumps, the constant breath of machinery began to drop out one by one, like musicians leaving a stage. For a few heartbeats, the ship hung, held by ice and buoyancy and the stubbornness of steel. Then something gave and she dropped not a plummet, not a cinematic fall, but a slow surrender. Water invaded spaces that had been dry a minute ago. The pressure equalized with a hiss like a long exhale. Anya's compartment shuddered. She grabbed the edge of the cabinet and felt her teeth click together. The deck under her boots shifted again, and for a moment she had the absurd thought that the whole ship was rolling over like a tired dog. Then there was a muffled impact, soft and final, and the Sev Morput came to rest on a seabed 30 meters down. Silence was not immediate. Steel kept talking. The hull popped and creaked as it adjusted to being held by silt and stones instead of water. In the corridors, loose chains swung and clinked. Somewhere, far away through flooded spaces, a bubble rose and burst. Elena found herself in a half-lit service corridor with a growing crowd of people, faces waxy under the emergency lights. Someone had a cut across his forehead that bled freely. Someone else was missing a boot. They counted, not with neat lists, but with hands on shoulders, eyes meeting eyes. "How many?" Dr. Petrov demanded, already moving like a man with a plan, because planning was the only way to keep his mind from dissolving. 32 here, Pavel said, hoarse. IA, maybe more aft. I can oft reach them. The Captain Pomenation's uniform was torn at the sleeve. He looked older than he had in Murmansk. "We go out," USI said, because that was what captains said when ships stopped behaving. "We get to the surface and signal that USI. Misha the diver shook his head slowly. Halka, Captain, there is no surface." "Ah, see," he said. "Ah, see, there is ice." Sokolov's eyes flashed. "Ice, ice, ends." Not here," Misha said, and he sounded almost gentle. "Not now, not now." They tried anyway, because humans try the obvious thing before they accept terror as reality. The first escape attempt was 2 men in immersion suits, Misha and another diver, with a line tied to the waist of each and a third person tending from the hatch. They flooded the improvised wet locker at that point, just a stairwell they were sacrificing to the CO, until the pressure equalized enough to open the outer door without it becoming a cannon. When the hatch swung, black water pressed in like a crowd. Misha disappeared first, his soutans' reflective stripes vanishing in seconds. The line paid out smoothly. Anya held it with gloved hands and tried not to imagine what was on the other side of the hatch. Twisted metal, drifting debris, the underside of ice like a ceiling made of teeth. Then the line jerked hard. Someone shouted. The line went slack, then taut again, sawing through Anya's palms despite the gloves. She leaned back with her weight, bracing, and felt the terrible intimacy of another human being fighting somewhere in the black. Minutes passed in a kind of slow panic, the hatch area filled with the sharp smell of rubber and cold seawater. Dr. Petrov watched the diver saying return times with the same face he used for surgery. When Misha came back through the hatch, he was shaking so hard the suit rattled. He grabbed the ladder rungs with hands that did not quite close. His eyes were wide behind the mask. "You no leads," he rasped, voice distorted by the respirator. "Age no air pockets. Etum percease. Etum percease." He swallowed and looked down at the water as if the water had offended him. "One if I's neezenes began. One if I's neezenes. Idea." The second diverations line had snagged on something in the wreck. They only got him back because Misha, hands barely working, went back out and cut it free by feel. When the man surfaced in the stairwell, he vomited into his mask and almost drowned in his own panic until someone ripped it off and held his head up. Afterward, in the dim corridor that had become their town square, Elena stood with dripping sleeves and said what no one wanted to hear. "We do not leave the ship," Anishi said. "All shall not blind, not into a roof of ice with no air. We stay here. We make this place hold Daishi." Sokolov stared at her. Captain, shipbreaker, schedule keeper. For a moment, he looked like he might argue. Then he looked around at the faces. Their red-lit skin, their wet hair, the way they clung to bulkheads as if the ship were the last solid thing in a world of water, and his authority seemed to float away like a broken antenna. He nodded once, small and terrible. "Then we live here," he said. In Anya's notebook, the next entry was not a number. "We are under the ice is the ceiling, the ship is the room is all of us." Chapter 3, 30 meters. At first, the ship felt like a patient in shock. Systems that had always been there, fans, lights, pumps A and OW, existed only as absence. The air hung still, heavier than it should have been, wet with the breath of too many people. Condensation beaded on every cold surface and fell in slow, maddening drips. Those drips became time. You could count hours by how many times a drop hit a metal tray. Elena turned the surviving compartments into a map the way a general turned terrain into strategy. The dry courier, the part of the ship that had sealed and time-aged, was smaller than anyone liked to say out loud. It included a slice of accommodation block where bunks still existed, the infirmary with its bright cabinets and bloodless smell, a service corridor that ran like a spine, a workshop full of tools and half-finished repairs, and an upper cargo deck accessible through a warped passage that groaned when you touched it. Everything below was flooded. They marked the borders with red tape scavenged from safety stores. Strips went across doors and down bulkheads, flooded beyond. "Do not open." The tape wasn't a physical barrier. It was a promise to not make a bad situation irredeemable. It was also a psychological line. People looked at it as if at the edge of a cliff. The captain tried to keep being a captain. He held briefings, asked for reports, spoke in the language of navigation and procedure. But procedure assumed a world with radio and horizon. Here, physics ran the meetings. Dr. Petrov took over the infirmary and immediately began issuing orders like prescriptions. "No unnecessary activity, HN," he said, holding up a handheld meter with a digital display. Every movement costs oxygen. Every movement makes carbon dioxide. A10. Someone laughed, the kind of short laugh people made when they were trying to keep their minds from screaming. "So what? We lie still until rescue? Sentayo." Petrovic's gaze was flat. "If you think lying still is easy, wait until your head hurts and your sleep stops working. 9. Anya watched Elena and Petrov circle each other like two people who agreed on the problem and disagreed on who owned it. The captain hovered in the overlap, hands empty. Power came first because without power there was no air, and without air there was no story. The Sevmorput had batteries for emergencies. The batteries were meant for hours, not weeks. Elena treated them like water in a desert. She shut down everything she could and still keep the habitat from turning into a refrigerator. Anya and the other electricians crawled through panels by flashlight, breath fogging their face shields. They scavenged intact breakers and rerouted circuits. They learned which lights could stay off without people losing their minds. They learned which corridors had to stay lit because in the dark, people made bad decisions. For the first day, they lived on battery power. The ship Assign's heartbeat reduced to a thin pulse. People spoke softly, as if loud voices might drain charge. On the second day, Elena ordered them to attempt the diesel auxiliary. The diesel generator had survived in a sealed space, but sealed did not mean healthy. The air intake ran through channels that now lay half submerged, and the fuel lines had been shaken hard enough that fittings wept. They assembled a team, Elena, 2 machinists, Anya, and Misha as the only one who could look at a flooded passage and see a route instead of a threat. The stairwell became their wetlock by accident and then by design. It was a vertical tube with a landing low enough to sacrifice. They sealed the upper door, flooded the lower landing intentionally, and made it a controlled wound, a place where the sea could be invited in under rules. The first time they used it on purpose, Anya sat on the upper step and watched black water rise like a slow decision. Her heart hammered in her throat. On the other side of the sealed door was the rest of the shippa, dark, tilted, full of things that floated now. When the pressure equalized, Misha opened the outer hatch and disappeared again, this time not to search for a surface, but to clear a path through their own wreck. The line ran between his hands and Anya Aza's like a taut sentence. Hours later, he returned with his suit streaked with silt and his eyes tired. Intake Anansa's blocked Ibia IDI iced. Ice and debris, something else is jammed in it like a fist. Elena listened, then nodded once. Then we unjam it. .uc. External work under the ice was not repair, it was spelunking in your own grave. They sent Misha out again with a pry bar and a saw. He worked by touch, fingers clumsy in thick gloves, the world reduced to pressure on his palms and the taste of air in his mask. When he came back he was quiet, which was worse than shaking. "It moved," he said at last, stripping off the hood. The ice, not a crack, not a lead. The whole ceiling and breathed. It breathes. Elena said, and her voice held neither comfort nor fear. Everything does. On the third day, the diesel auxiliary coughed itself awake. The sound was a rough, beautiful thing. It vibrated through the bulkheads and made people stop in corridors, listening as if to music. Lights steadied from red emergency dim to a pale, sickly normal. Fans began to turn, reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence. The air moved again, and with movement came a slight easing of the pressure in people's skulls. They cheered, and the cheer became a coughing fit for two men who were already feeling the air debt. Elena let them have the moment. Then she shut doors and put rules on paper. Discipline al aundas, she said, writing on a whiteboard salvaged from a training room. Aunda, no improvised heaters, no open flames, no cigarette lighters, no overloads. We run loads by schedule. If you need power for a tool, you ask. Someone muttered, ask? Like schoolchildren. Elena turned and looked at him. In the dim light, her face was composed in the way of someone who had accepted the shape of a problem. You are not schoolchildren, she said, as she schoolchildren can go outside when they make mistakes. UN. They tried to call home anyway, because hope is a reflex. The radio room was a wrecked shrine, cables torn from sockets, panels ripped away by the crushing of the superstructure. Kostya Lebedev, the communications officer, sat with his headset on as if listening harder could create signal. He tried every frequency, every backup, every trick he learned from older men who lied about miracles. He got static and silence. Emergency beacon.ne? Sokolov asked, clinging to procedure. Kostya shook his head. IED destroyed topside, he said. IED or it cannot break through the ice. Even if ITD break through the ice, even if ITD's reaming into a pillow. Pavel said, what about a buoy, Mayana? Kostya gave him a look that was almost pity. Buoy to where? Into solid ice? Ian? They sat in the corridor afterward, a group of adults reduced to listening to the fans. Nissan travels Anya, Anya said quietly. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words fell out of her like breath. In water. Better than radio. Anya. Elena's gaze sharpened. Ice acoustic 9. Kostya blinked as if waking. We don't have a proper transducer. Yushin? We have a ship full of metal and coils, Elena said. Elena said, we have brains. We have time, whether we want it or not. Xi. Time. The word tasted wrong. That evening, Dr. Petrov gathered them and explained the second enemy. He held up a canister the size of a small suitcase. Okay, econ, sorbent, a CO sorbent, econ, he said. Econ, we have a finite stock. It is designed for emergencies, not for living under the sea for months. We can generate oxygen if power holds. But carbon dioxide econi, he tapped the canister like a coffin lid. How long, someone asked. Petrov shrugged, the most honest gesture he'd made since the sinking. Weeks if we are careful, less if we are not. The captain looked at the red tape lines in the corridor, at the sealed doors that held back the sea, and finally understood that the ship was not just damaged, it was a closed system now, a box. In a box, the air did not forgive. Anya went to her bunk and tried to sleep. The fauna's hum was comforting until she remembered it depended on diesel and luck. In the dark, she imagined carbon dioxide as a thing you could see, a slow tide rising around their ankles. In her notebook, she drew a small rectangle and wrote next to it, we are a room inside a room inside a room. Ice, water, steel, air. Chapter 4, Red Lines. The red tape did not move, but the border it represented did. On day 6, Elena revised the map. She stood in the service corridor with a grease pencil and a flashlight, while Anya held the flashlight steady. The ship was tilted 3 degrees to starboard, maybe 4. It was hard to tell without instruments that trusted gravity. In some places, the tilt was a comforter. It told you the ship still had a coherent orientation. In other places, it made doors swing half open like mouths that wanted to speak. Bulkhead here is sweating, Elena said, pressing her palm against cold steel. It was not sweat. It was condensation from temperature gradients that should not exist in a healthy ship. It was the ship's body trying, clumsily, to manage its new environment. Anya watched droplets gather at Elena's fingertips and fall. Does that mean a leak? It means a weak point, Elena said. Everything means a weak point now, Sasha. They worked in routines because routine was a fence against panic. Every shift began with a head count, a COSN reading, a battery check, a pump check. Dr. Petrov posted the COSN numbers on the infirmary door as if public shame could keep molecules from accumulating. 0.8%, 0.9%, 0.00%. At 1.0%, people began to complain of headaches. By 1.2%, they became irritable in ways that surprised them. Small arguments turned into big ones because the brain, drowning slowly in its own exhaust, went looking for simple enemies. Someone accused someone else of taking an extra slice of bread. Someone else accused the medical officer of hoarding oxygen for the infirmary. A machinist punched an electrician over a joke he would have laughed at in Murmansk. Petrov treated the punch like a symptom. Activity limits, he announced. No unnecessary travel between compartments, no exercising, no keeping warm by doing squats. If you need to move, you report it. If you need to work, you work. Otherwise, you lie down and you breathe slowly. We are not prisoners, someone said. Petrovichan's eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. You are inside steel, he said. The sea is outside, the ice is above. Call it what you like. Sokolov tried to challenge him. The captain still had the idea that authority was a line you drew with a title. As eye doctor, you don't command the ship. Petrov turned to him with a look that was almost kind. Captain, the ship is gone, he said. AC what remains is a life support problem. Elena didn't mean. She didn't need to. The crews need to. The crew's loyalty was shifting naturally toward the people who could keep them alive, and no amount of fridge voice could compete with oxygen. They built the acoustic transducer in the workshop from things that had never been intended to speak through water. Kostya came with schematics drawn on damp paper. Anya brought coils and a cracked transformer salvaged from a flooded panel. Elena brought a sledgehammer, because sometimes you needed persuasion more than elegance. The idea was simple enough: create a pulse strong enough to travel through the water column, repeating in a pattern that no iceberg or whale would produce by accident. A heartbeat, Elena called it. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short. Pause, repeat. Mounting it outside the hull was harder. On day 9, Misha led a dive team out through the wet lock to fix a pump intake valve that was beginning to stick. They needed that valve. If it failed, the diesel auxiliary would overheat and shut down, and the air would stop moving. Misha went first, and behind him went Sergei Vasilyev, a quiet machinist who had volunteered because his hands were good and his fear was private. Anya watched their line speed out, her jaw clenched so hard her molars ached. Elena stood beside her, eyes on the line like it was a gauge. Oh, count their time, Meow, she said softly. Anya counted. 10 minutes, 15, 20. The line jerked at 22 minutes. Misha's tug pattern came back at 2 short, 1 long, the signal for trouble. Anya's hands went numb as she braced and began to haul, not with brute strength but with patient, coordinated pulls timed with the linea's give. Slow, Plo Elena warned. If you panic, you pull him into something. Yauna. Anya swallowed and forced her arms to move like machinery. Pull, rest, pull, rest. When Misha surfaced in the stairwell, he was dragging Sergeysen's line behind him, and the line ended in nothing. For a moment, Anya didn't understand what she was seeing. Her brain tried to fill in the missing shape. Then she saw Misha Shah's eyes. Miside is duck stuck, Misha said through the respirator, voice raw. Aster H narrowing, metal H narrowing, metal shifted. I kind. Elena's face did not change, but something in her posture tightened, as if she were bracing against a wave. Where? Misha shook his head, a small motion made large by the suit. IH machinery corridor, before the valve room. The ship moved. The ice pushed. He went through and then on. The next hour became a series of choices that felt like crimes. They sent Misha back with a cutting tool and a second diver. They held the lines and listened to the faint vibrations of steel and water. Dr. Petrov stood at the top of the wet lock, stopwatch in hand, as if time could be negotiated. When Misha came back, he was crying inside the mask, tears floating on his cheeks like tiny, weightless insults. Aishi haze wedged, ause haze she's wedged. Ashitast against the frame. The more I pull, the more it bites. I cannot cut the frame without cutting him. Elena closed her eyes for 1 heartbeat, then opened them. Then we stop, as she said. We can try longer, Sokolov said, and his voice rose in desperation. We kanya nyanya. Captain, Elena said, and she spoke his title like a warning. Every minute we keep this hatch open, we flood more of the stairwell. Every minute we keep divers in the water, we spend oxygen and heat we cannot replace. If the wet lock fails, we lose the only access route to the flooded sections. We lose everything. Etia. Silence filled the small space, thick as syrup. Dr. Petrov looked at Sokolov. Alvar, do you want one dead? He asked quietly. Alvar, all of us? Sokolovati's shoulders sagged. He looked down into the black water as if expecting the sea to offer compromise. It offered nothing. Elena nodded once. I seal the door, she said. Anya's hands moved on their own. She turned the wheel on the upper hatch until it locked. Metal clanged. A boundary became permanent. Later, when the wet lock was drained back to its controlled level, they stood in the corridor and listened to the ship creak. Somewhere beyond the red tape, Sergei Vasilyev was still inside the ship in the flooded darkness, held by a hatch that had narrowed like a closing mouth. The crew did not hold a ceremony. They did not have the air budget for grief that involved shouting. Nadja made a thin soup that night and put an extra spoonful of salt in each bowl. Salt was a cheap way to pretend food had weight. People ate and stared at their hands. Anya went to the infirmary and found Dr. Petrov writing in a ledger. The paper was already damp at the edges from the Shipachansi's humidity. "What are you doing, Daddy Yen?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Aichi counting," he said. "Counting what? Are you?" "Breaths on breaths," said in his pen, scratched like an insect. "Hours on zeg hours. Canisters. Calories. People. .oe." He finally looked at her. "If we make it out, you will," he said. "Ashan, he said, will ask how it happened. They will ask what we did. They will ask why some lived and some did not. You will." Anya swallowed. "Asi, will the answers matter?" Petrovich's eyes held something like exhaustion and something like anger. "They will matter to the people who want to pretend it didn't amend you, now you do," he said. In her notebook that night, Anya began her own ledger because she suddenly understood what Petrov meant. "Not the poetry of survival," she wrote, "the math." Chapter 5, The Lab Module. By the third week, the air began to change in ways the meters hadn't yet admitted. It wasn't just headaches. It was the way people allsperse all snagged, like threads catching on a splinter. It was forgetting why you already entered a corridor. It was waking from sleep with the sense that someone had been sitting on your chest. Dr. Petrov put new rules in place and wrote them in a careful hand as if clarity could be enforced by ink. No more than 6 people in the workshop at once. No more than 10 minutes in the wet-locked chamber, fully sealed, without a fan. No arguments louder than conversation. If you feel rage, sit down. The last line made men laugh until the laughter turned into coughing. They were rationing breath now, and the ship's personality was shifting. The Sevmorput had been a machine with humans inside. She was becoming a habitat with machinery as organs. The two concepts did not fit together neatly. It made everything feel improvised, even the things that were not. Pavel Tikhonov found the lab module container on a day when the ship groaned in a way that made everyone go still. He had been doing his own rounds, partly because he still felt responsible for cargo, partly because keeping busy was his way of keeping sane. The upper cargo deck was reachable through a passage that had warped from the sinking. You had to turn sideways and breathe shallowly to get through, like crawling through the throat of the ship. On the other side, the hold opened into a space that smelled of cold metal and old rope. The waterline had not reached it, not yet. Containers loomed like apartment blocks, their sides sweating condensation. Most of them held what they said they held: food, medical supplies, spare parts. The white container sat where it had been loaded, intact, and annoyingly clean. Pavel ran a hand over the stenciled warning, "Lab modula fragile as keep dry." Someone had sealed it with extra straps, an expense that made no sense for mere pumps and LEDs. He brought Elena and Anya to see it. "The Elena," Pavel said, and he did not try to sound casual, "as this thing is exactly what we need if we see her going to stop chewing through sorbent like candy. Easier." Elena's eyes narrowed. "I say, explain." Pavel pointed at the stenciled equipment list on a laminated sheet attached to the container inside. ASIN LED arrays. Pumps, filters, sterilization gear, nutrient salts, tubing. It towns a box for growing something, for a station outpost on Eversea. Anya, hearing the word sterilization, thought of mold and damp walls and the way their socks never fully dried. "Iron growing what?" "Iron growing," she asked. Pavel shrugged. "Iochi plants, I thought, or algae. Some station science. But I don't like the paperwork. Iochio." He showed them his tablet, the manifest lines he'd downloaded before the SATCOM died. The lab module was coded in a way that didn't match the rest of the cargo. The supplier name was abbreviated, the destination outpost listed only as a coordinate set. Could be just bureaucracy," Elena said. Pavel met her gaze. "Iron bureaucracy doesn't usually look expensive," he said. They brought the container into the workshop with more care than they have given any human body. It took 12 people and a system of improvised rollers made from spare piping. The ship's tilt made the whole operation feel like trying to carry a refrigerator up a hill. When it finally clanged into place, the crew stared at it like an altar. Opening it was like opening a promise. Inside were neatly packed cases, foam-lined, labeled in Russian and English, panels of violet LEDs wrapped in protective film, pumps that looked too delicate for shipboard life, filters, sterile bags, a small autoclave unit with its own manual. And, tucked behind a false panel, a metal case no one had mentioned. Pavel found it first. He went quiet and pried it out with fingertips that had suddenly become careful. The case was sealed with security tape and had a symbol printed on it that made Dr. Petrov stiffen when he saw it: Biohazard. What is that doing on a resupply run? Petrov asked, and his voice had lost its clinical neutrality. Elena looked at Pavel. You didn't I know? Pavel's face was pale. It wasn't in a manifest in Wanna, he said. Not that I saw. You wanna? And wanna? Anya felt her stomach drop. In a sealed habitat, contamination was not an abstract concept. It was a death sentence wearing a different name. Petrov took the case into the infirmary and locked it in a cabinet. And Adai we do not open this aqua, he said. Awidai even touch it unless we must. Edai. Elena didn't might argue. But later, alone with Anya in the workshop, she spoke as if to the ship itself. Aman, someone packed survival into our hold, Ananji, she said, on purpose or by accident. Either way, we use what we can. They did not plant wheat. They did not talk about fields or harvests, because those words belonged to a world with sun. They started with mushrooms. The lab module Essation gear let them attempt something that would otherwise have been fantasy, controlled cultivation inside a ship whose air wanted to grow mold on every surface. They gathered cardboard from packaging, shredded it, soaked it, pressed it into trays. They used the autoclave until it complained under the load, sterilizing substrate with a seriousness that bordered on worship. Someone found a small jar of mushroom spawn in the lab supplies intended, perhaps, for a feed trial at an outpost. It was the sort of thing you might ignore in normal life. In their life, it became gold. Nadia, the cook, cried when she saw the first white threads take hold in the trays. Adiang's alive, Kenyim, she whispered, as if that was news. The first crop failed. It failed quietly at first, a faint, sweet smell, then a fuzz of gray-green creeping across the substrate like frost. Dr. Petrov smelled it and swore, then ordered the entire tray set sealed and removed. Two men who had sneaked into the workshop at night, hungry for the idea of food, ate a handful of the contaminated growth anyway. One vomited for hours. The other broke out in hives and then in a fever that made him babble. Petrov quarantined them in a cabin and spoke to the crew with a voice that did not shake, because shaking would invite challenge. Farming is sanitation, he said. Not hope, not a hobby, sanitation. If you cannot obey rules, you will die and take us with you, Isia. The crew listened. Nobody argued. The man with the fever stopped babbling on the third day and began to breathe shallowly, a frightening, efficient breathing that made Petrov watch him closely. Lenin Kapostopher told Elena, number after Evanstaller, it creeping up. They call her Evanstaller E. Elena looked at the sorbent inventory. The numbers were becoming a countdown. They tried again, this time with ritual. Hands washed, gloves worn, masks not just for dust but for spores. The workshop became a clean room by stubbornness and a schedule. Anya rewired the LED arrays and hung them on a frame, bathing the cultivation corner in a violet glow that made everyone sense skin look bruised. Under that light, new trays grew slow, careful white. This time the smell was earthy, honest. Small caps formed, pale as knuckles. Nadia cooked the first successful mushrooms with a sprinkle of dried herbs scavenged from a spice jar someone had laughed about packing in Murmansk. The crew ate in silence, and the tasty, mild, damp rila hit them like memory. Isho's not enough, Sichami Pavel said afterward, practical as ever. Enya said, and surprised herself with how fierce she sounded. Petrov stood with his EOS Cohen meter and looked at the violet-lit corner like it was a new organ Theaton grafted onto the ship. It buys us time, he said. Asanon an not air, not miracles, time. That night, Elena went to the captain's cabin. Sokolov sat on his bunk with his boots on, staring at a blank wall. The cabin smelled faintly of tobacco and damp paper. His logbook lay open but unwritten. Elena did not sit. We found something, she said. He looked up, eyes tired. Eyes? Rescue? Reckly? Not yet, Elena said. A lab module. It has equipment that can help us grow food, possibly manage COID. With algae. Sokolovation's laugh was bitter. We are farmers now. Sign. We are survivors, Elena said. I need you to understand something. 9. His gaze sharpened, defensive. I go on. You are ordered to keep schedule, Elena said. Elena, we all heard it. We all knew the ice was early. If we ever see air again, they will look for a place to put blame. They will put it on the person closest to the decision. Often. So Koloveja's jaw worked. You want me to confess, Maima? Elena shook her head. I want you to stop thinking that obedience buys safety, as she said. It never has. Not here. She left him with that and returned to the corridor where the Shipason's new heartbeat lived, fans turning, pumps thumping, people breathing with measured discipline. Anya, in her bunk, wrote under the Deos's COE reading. The ship has a garden now and a secret box we Nartan are not supposed to open. Chapter 6, Green Debt. Diesel made a comforting sound, but diesel was a lie they could measure. Elena knew the auxiliary generator affers fuel consumption down to the liter. Pavel knew it too because cargo manifests were his religion. By the 5th week, their calculations stopped being abstract and began to become verdicts. We have weeks of diesel, Pavel said in the workshop, tapping his tablet where he should build the spreadsheet by flashlight. I down, months. Annie. Dr. Petrov rubbed his temple. And we need months. Elena looked at the reactor controls like a locked door in a burning house. Then we bring her back, and now she said. No one cheered at the thought of a nuclear plant running under ice on the seabed. The Sevmor-Potosh's reactor had scrammed automatically when the ship took the second shove at an elegant safety feature that now felt like a moral problem. Sokolov arrived for the meeting, thin and unslept, and stood behind Elena as if trying to reclaim position by proximity. Is it safe? He asked. Elena didn't sugarcoat. It's just safer than suffocating, she said. ID, we bring it up to minimal power. We keep cooling stable. We monitor like our lives depend on it. Audio. They do, Anya said under her breath. The cooling system had taken damage in the sinking. Intake channels that had once drawn seawater cleanly were now clogged with ice shards and debris, and one of the lines had been kinked when the hull settled. Elena could see the problem on the diagrams and in the way the remaining pumps sounded slightly wrong. Fixing it meant going out again. The wetlock became a place of silent preparation. Misha checked seals, straps, hoses. Anya checked the electrical connections for the portable lights and the pump tools. Dr. Petrov checked oxygen tanks and tried not to show how much he hated being unable to control what the sea did to flesh. If you feel your fingers go numb, Hash Petrov told Misha, you come back. You do not push through. One. Misha's eyes crinkled. I doctor, he said. He said. I many fingers have been numb since I joined the Navy. Petrov did not laugh. And you will come back anyway. Ayusha. They chose a time when the ship was quiet, when the ice above was not audibly groaning. Elena called it listening for the ice tie-in's mood. Sokolov would have called it superstition. He said nothing, because superstition had started to look like wisdom. Misha and a second diver, Yuriat Young, deckhand whose nerves were still raw enough to make him honest, went out with a sled of tools. The black water swallowed them, and the line hummed in Anya's hands. She counted their time because counting was what you did when you couldn't do anything else. 20 minutes. 30. The first sign of trouble was not a tug, but a vibration, a low tremor that ran through the line like a warning. Elena leaned closer. Ice she shifting, Maymerd, she murmured. Anya's stomach tightened. She remembered Misha's words. The ceiling breathed. The line jerked, 1C, 2 short, 1 long, trouble. They hauled with measured urgency until the diversest shapes emerged into the stairwell, suits streaked with silt. Urias's mask was fogged from his frantic breathing. Misha's eyes were slitted, focusing on something only he could feel. We cleared the intake, Misha said, and his voice sounded like gravel. But the line's there is a crack in the intake housing. Not big. But if you run phalange... We once is, Elena said. We run minimal. Yuri pulled off his hood and vomited seawater onto the landing, then sat with his head against the bulkhead as if ashamed to be alive. Dr. Petrov checked his hands and found the fingertips pale. He should not dive again, Major Petrov said. Elena nodded without argument. He wanted a dotatinia. They brought the reactor back like you brought back a patient from anesthesia, slow, careful, measuring every response. Elena stood at the controls with her hands steady and her voice low. Anya monitored the electrical loads, watching the ammeters as if they were heart monitors. Kostya hovered with a clipboard, recording numbers that might later become evidence. When the reactor, slow power hum returned, it did not feel triumphant. It felt like a bargain. Heat began to creep into the ducts. The air warmed enough that the constant condensation eased from rain to mist. Fans ran with less strain. Lights stopped flickering in sympathy with the diesel. People slept better for 3 nights, then the headaches returned because heat and light did not solve chemistry. The algae idea moved from an maybe a dot to a fine a now dot yada. The lab module had been built for clean growth in a clean station room. Their ship was neither clean nor stable, but it had one advantage: it was already a closed system. If they could get algae growing in sealed tanks, they could pull carbon dioxide out of the air and replace some of the sorbent debt with biology. We need a starter culture, Anya said, looking at the pumps and tubing laid out on the workshop bench. Pavelas's face twitched. We have one, Nasha, he said, and his eyes flicked toward the infirmary cabinet where Dr. Petrov had locked the biohazard case. Petrov said no. He said no, with the force of a man who had seen infection in environments where infection became apocalypse. If that case contains a pathogenic strain, if it contains anything that can aerosolize AI, he shook his head. In a sealed ship, we cannot afford to be wrong. EI. AFDI. Well. Elena listened, then asked a question that made Petrovech's mouth tighten. Do we have a better option? Silence. Petrov exhaled, long and controlled. If we open it, he said, I fish we do it like surgery, and if it looks wrong, we stop. They opened it in the workshop under the violet LEDs with everyone masked and gloved. The security tape tore with a sound like betrayal. Inside were cryovials packed in foam, labeled in a neat machine-printed font, not names like spirulina or chlorella, codes, a sheet of instructions in a sealed plastic pouch. A logo at the top that meant nothing to Anya and made Pavlesh's face go grayer, an institute mark, the sort you saw in reports that didn't circulate widely. Elena read the instructions twice, lips moving. A fine cyanobacteria, she said. A high rate CO and time. High protein yield, you are taught. You are time. Petrovine's gaze hardened. So genetically modified, he said, not as a guess, but as recognition. So, .ur, someone muttered. IID, we thought it were genetically modified by vodka.uri. No one laughed. They seeded the first tank anyway because the air did not care about ethics. They filled a sealed plastic reservoir with warmed water, added nutrient salts, and injected 1 vial of his worth of green-brown liquid that looked like nothing. For 2 days, the tank smelled like wet pond and disappointment. Then the water began to thicken, turning an honest, offensive green. The algae didn't look like salvation. It looked like something you would scrape off a boat hull and curse. But when Petrov held the COEOD uni ESM ometer over the tank as vent and watched the numbers dip slightly, his expression changed in a way that made Anya Iaz's throat tighten. It says, working, he said. They built more tanks. They ran tubing through the air ducts, so exhaled air would bubble through the slurry. The ship began to smell faintly of brine and chlorophyll, as if a swamp had moved in and paid rent. Dr. Petrov instituted new rules. No one touches the algae systems without gloves, he said. A Kamenisi, he said. No one tastes it, no one jokes about it being soup. If contamination hits, we lose it and we lose time we do not have. The crew obeyed because the headaches eased. Not banished, nothing banished ignitas, but eased. People else compares became less sharp. Sleep became less haunted. Then the ship reminded them she was still a wreck. It happened at night, during a quiet shift when the only sound was fans and the occasional distant pop of steel. Anya woke to a new noise, a thin, steady hiss-like breath through teeth. She sat up, heart racing. The air was colder. The sound came from the corridor. Elena was already there, flashlight beam cutting through the dim. She pressed her ear to a bulkhead seam and listened. And seal failure, she said, and her voice was tight. And she. Water was finding a path. They tracked it to a door gasket that had been damaged in the crush, now giving up under the constant pressure differential between dry compartment and flooded neighbor. A thin line of seawater seeped in and ran down the steel like tears. Patch it, someone said. Elena shook her head. We don't have the right gasket. We can try to clamp and seal, but if it blows a con, she glanced at the red tape line behind them. If it blows hard, it floods this corridor. We lose the workshop. We lose the algae. The corridor held their life now. Power distribution, tools, the lab module's heart. It couldn't be gambled. Elena made another decision that felt like a crime. We retreat, she said. We shrink the core. Data-2A. Havel swore, a low, ugly sound. Nadia made a noise like she'd deep and punched. They moved what they could in hours because the leak did not wait. Tools went first, then LED panels, then pumps. Personal items were last, and many stayed behind because a wrench mattered more than a photograph. Anya went to her cabin and stared at her locker. Inside were a letter from her mother Shitine never answered and a small set of earrings Shitine worn once at a wedding. She took the letter and left the earrings. She did not know why. When everything that mattered had been dragged back across the corridor, Elena ordered the door dogged shut. They added a new strip of red tape across it and wrote on the bulkhead with marker. LOSD, do not open. The hiss became a gurgle. Water rose behind the sealed door like a slow triumph. That night, the shipitable space got smaller, and the crew end's language got quieter. They spoke in fewer syllables, conserving not just breath but feeling. In the violet-lit workshop, the algae tanks bubbled steadily, indifferent to grief. Misha watched them for a long time, then said almost conversationally, "Oh, we jerping interest now. Ija." Anya looked at him. On what? You know? Misha tapped the side of a tank, and the green slurry shivered. On being alive, he said. Chapter 7. The Beacon. They became experts in uncertainty. The acoustic transducer, once built, became another ritual. Every day at the same hours, they powered it up and sent its heartbeat through the hull into the black water outside. 3 short pulses, 1 long, 3 short. Pause. Repeat. Kostya insisted on the pattern. It has to sound like intention, he said. Nature is random. Machines are not. .ge. Misha mounted the transducer on the outside of the hull during a dive that everyone treated like a funeral rehearsal. He bolted it to a section of plating near the highest point they could reach without risking a full exposure to the ship aside. The bolts squealed as he tightened them, the sound carrying through steel to the wet lock like a distant scream. When he came back, frost-rimed and shaking, he stripped off his gloves and flexed his fingers slowly until they obeyed again. It sails, out there, and sound, he said. Is it working? Anya asked. Misha shrugged. It vibrates, Asian, he said. I doesn't whether anyone hears it is the universe's problem. Asian. Weeks turned into a count of maintenance cycles. The algae tanks became stable enough that the COA number stopped climbing so steeply. They were still spending sorbent, but not at the same pace. Mushrooms provided occasional texture and a reason to celebrate small anniversaries. 1 month. 2. 100 days under ice. On day 113, Nadja baked a cake out of crushed biscuits and algae paste and laughed until she cried. The cake tasted like resignation. They ate it anyway. The harder their internal system became, the more the outside world felt like myth. The surface any people said, as if speaking of a place from childhood. Open sky, any wind, they said these words softly because loud nostalgia hurt. Elena did not let nostalgia run the ship. She spent hours with Kostya and Anya studying the plans, hunting for one more option. Radio was dead unless they could reach air. Beacons couldn't break through meters of moving pack. A buoy couldn't surface into solid ice. The acoustic heartbeat might travel, might not, and even if it did, it offered no precise location. We need a marker above the ice, Kostya said one evening, voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Something that screams where satellites can hear it, Ko, we cannot surface out. We cannot surface out, and Misha said, immediately. How, no leads. Elena tapped the ship's plans. We don't need to surface sounder, she said. We need a hole. They found the vertical trunk on the diagrams, an old ventilation shaft that ran toward the superstructure, now crushed and stripped. In a normal ship, it carried air and cables. In their ship, it became a possible spine to climb. The shaft's lower access hatch was reachable through a crawl space that made Anya's ribs ache. Beyond it, the trunk angled upward through twisted metal, partly filled with debris, and ended somewhere in the wrecked upper works. We melt up, Elena said. Elaine, we make a narrow vent. Then we push a beacon into the ice high enough to get signal out. Dr. Petrov stared at her. And if the ice crushes the shaft while someone is in it? Elena didn't look away. Then we lose someone, she said. A linear we lose everyone slowly. Ud. They debated it for 2 days, which was how long it took for the CO timing meter to tick up by 1/10 and make debate feel like luxury. The first acid chimney attempt began with heat. They built a thermal head from scavenged heating elements and copper pipe, a crude drill that would melt ice instead of cutting it. They ran it on a power schedule so strict Anya could recite it in her sleep. Elena insisted on a reinforced casing around a Tydo steel sections welded in the workshop, thick enough to resist the Ison's impatient teeth for a while. The team was Elena, Misha, Anya, and Yuriatri, redeemed from his vomiting dive by a fierce desire to be useful in a way that did not require open water. They climbed into the ventilation trunk like miners into a narrow shaft. The walls were cold and wet. Every sound echoed. Every breath felt loud. Anya wedged herself at a junction box and worked by headlamp, hands trembling as she connected the thermal head to power leads. Misha and Yuri hauled the reinforced casing upward a meter at a time, the steel scraping, sparks occasionally spitting when it kissed metal. When the thermal head powered up, it began to hiss and steam, heat turning ice to water and water to vapor, the shaft filled with warm fog that smelled faintly of rust. For the first time in months, Anya felt sweat on her skin that had nothing to do with fear. For 6 hours, they made progress, a meter, then another. The drill head ate upward into the ice ceiling, leaving a narrow cylinder of meltwater that refroze behind them in brittle layers. Then the ice moved. It wasn't undramatic. It was a change in pressure that made the shaft groan. The reinforced casing flexed. Somewhere above, a ridge pressed down as if testing the hole they were making. Maka, Misha said instantly. Maka bak now. They tried to reverse the casing and extract the drill head. The metal scraped and caught. Elena swore softly and leaned her way into it. The shaft shuddered. A shower of ice fragments fell like glass. Yuri cried out as a shard sliced his cheek. Anya felt the walls close. A subtle tightening and panic punched through her ribs. She pushed backward, shoulders scraping, mouth dry. Behind them, the casing buckled with a sound like a sigh. They escaped into the corridor on hands and knees, coughing steam. Dr. Petrov slapped gauze onto Yurianza's cut and looked at Elena as if she had personally offended nature. "We were lucky," he said. Elena's eyes were wild, furious at luck being the only currency. "A fart luck is a tool," she said. "A fart she said you when you use it." The second attempt was worse. They reinforced the casing further, adding ribs, making it heavier until moving it felt like dragging a grave marker. They waited for what they thought was a calmer ice cycle, Misha listening at the wet lock, ear pressed to steel, calling it good. They climbed again. They melted upward again. They made it farther 2 meters more Rita before the ceiling decided it was done being drilled. The ice shift came as a sudden compression that cracked the casing and snapped one of the power leads. A blue arc flashed in the shaft, bright enough to paint Anya's vision. The smell of burned insulation filled her mouth. "Fire? Fire?" someone shouted, and in a sealed ship that word turned every spine to ice. Elena killed power instantly. They crawled out of the shaft and into the corridor where Petrov and 2 others waited with extinguishers and wet cloths. Smoke did not billow, it crept, thin and poisonous, and a ventilation fan spread it like gossip. They sealed a door and watched the smoke through a small inspection window until the air cleared enough to breathe without tasting plastic. The shipment's filters took the hit, their efficiency dropping in a way the meters recorded mercilessly over the next days. "We cannot do this again," Engam Petrov said, voice shaking with controlled anger. "Egam may not with arcing wires, not with smoke. Egam may." Elena sat at the workshop bench that night with her head in her hands. Her knuckles were scraped, her nails broken. The algae tanks bubbled beside her like indifferent pets. Anya sat across from her, notebook open. "What now?" she asked, because she could not imagine letting the shaft be the end of the idea. Elena lifted her head. Her eyes were bloodshot. "One shot Sienha," she said. "We stop pretending we can keep a shaft open long term. We build a marker that can survive being crushed long enough to do its job. That why." Kostya leaned in, hungry for any plan. A beacon?" "Drill and a beacon in one," Elena said. "It melts up through the last ice, pushes a transmitter into air, screams once, and dies." Pavel looked sick. "And the ice chimney? Yolji, and the ice chimney?" Elena's jaw tightened. "We don't keep a chimney," she said. "EVE, we make a needle hole. Just enough, EVU. Just enough." They built the one-shot marker out of salvage and stubbornness. The casing was a length of thick-walled pipe reinforced with welded rings. The thermal head was smaller, hotter, designed to melt fast and not linger. Inside, Anya wired a stripped-down transmitter from emergency equipment and spare parts and minimal power draw, maximal scream. Kostya programmed it to repeat a burst for exactly 70 seconds on every frequency it could manage, then shut down to conserve the last battery for one more burst if it somehow survived. "Why 70, Jan?" Anya asked. Kostya shrugged. "Oh, long enough to be noticed, Tizan," he said. "IG short enough to pretend it was an accident if someone asks, Yushi." They waited for a day when the ice's groans felt less angry. Misha listened and declared, with the weary authority of someone who had begun to treat ice like a living thing, "Now, Alana." They hauled the marker into the ventilation trunk and wedged it into place below the point where the casing had buckled on the first attempt. They did not try to clear the old damage. They accepted it as part of the path, a scar. Anya Asa's hands shook as she connected the power lead. "If it arcs the night, T." "It Wednesday? A Wednesday?" Elena said, not because she knew, but because someone had to speak certainty into the shaft. They powered it up. The marker hummed, then hissed, then began to climb in slow increments as the thermal head melted ice and the casing was pushed upward by a crude mechanical jack they had built in the trunk's lower section. It was ugly engineering, the kind you did when the textbooks had been drowned. Minutes passed. The marker moved another few centimeters. Another. Steam filled the shaft and condensed on their faces. Yuri Ashan's eyes were wide with the strange joy of doing something that might matter. Then the ice above groaned. Misha swore and braced the casing with his shoulder. Elena's hands tightened on the jack handle until her knuckles went white. Anya held her breath without meaning to. The marker shuddered but did not buckle. Its reinforced rings held, biting into the shaft walls. "Secret, keep going," Elena rasped. The jack squealed. The marker climbed. Steam roared. The shaft vibrated with pressure. Then, abruptly, the sound changed. The hiss became a rush. Cold air spilled downward like a ghost. Anya felt it on her cheeks. Dry, sharp, not recycled. Not ship air. Different. Kostyach's eyes went wide. It broke through, he whispered. He whispered. Above, somewhere beyond steel and ice and meters of moving pack, a Marker-S transmitter fired. They heard nothing of the screamin'. It went into air, not into their corridorsin, but they saw its proof on the small indicator light Anya had wired into the control line, a rapid blinking that meant broadcast. 70 seconds. Anya counted without speaking. 10, 20, 30. At 45 seconds, the ship shuddered, a long tremor as if the ice had noticed the insult. The ventilation trunk groaned, and a chunk of refreezing meltwater broke loose and fell, smacking the casing with a hollow thud. At 60 seconds, the indicator light sputtered. At 70, it went dark. For a moment, no one moved. They stared at the dead light like it might come back if begged. Elena released the jack handle and sat down hard against the shaft wall. Her breath came in ragged pulls. Did it work? Did it work? Yuri asked, voice thin. Kostya swallowed. It screamed, I see, he said. If anyone was listening, I see. Misha laughed once, short and bitter. If anyone wants to hear, he corrected. They climbed out of the shaft slowly, as if leaving it might jinx the fragile possibility the aging created. Back in the corridor, Dr. Petrov checked their pupils, their hands, their breathing, looking for signs of smoke exposure or COKA, induced stupidity. He found only exhaustion and a strange brightness in their eyes. That night, the Sevmorput creaked and settled on the seabed, and the algae tanks bubbled, and the acoustic heartbeat continued its patient pulse into the dark. And somewhere above, in air they could not touch, a transmitter that had lived for 70 seconds had told the world, in the only language it could, that they were still alive. Chapter 8. Listening. The first person to hear them was not the person who was supposed to. Irina Smirnova lived in a white building that the map treated like a comma on the edge of the Kara Sea. The building had a generator that hated her and walls that sweated just like the Sevmorputanas, only here the sweat ran outward into the wind. She was a technician for an oceanographic monitoring stationess, officially a research outpost, unofficially a place where the sea was listened to for reasons no one wrote down in plain language. Her job was to watch lines on screens and turn sound into meaning. On the day the Sevmorputa's one-shot marker screamed, Irina was drinking tea that tasted of metal and boredom. The station was quiet. The sea under the ice was full of its usual songs, distant pressure ridges grinding, a faint chorus of wind, occasional whale clicks like someone tapping a pencil. It was noise that became texture after enough months. Then, a new shape appeared. A burst on a frequency range that didn't might belong to ice. Too structured, too abrupt, too short. Irina sat up, fingers on the keyboard, and pulled up the spectrum view. The signal repeated, but only once a flicker, 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 like something gasping for attention. She checked the timestamp. She checked the station logs. She checked the weather feed as if weather could explain a scream. Then she did the things she wasn't supposed to do without prompting. She cross-referenced the burst against the Emergency Beacon ID database, an old file kept on the station server for calibration.unow. The match hit like a slap. It was a civilian emergency protocol signature, not clean, not textbook, but close enough to make her stomach drop. Irina picked up the phone and called the number she only used when the C sounded wrong. A man answered on the second ring. He didn't give his name, he didn't need to. I have a burst, Irina said, forcing her voice steady. It matches an emergency protocol, civilian. Silence on the line, and then, coordinate estimate, na. Irina looked at the screen. Rough, under ice. I need triangulation.ed. Send the data, man said, and there was something in his tone that made her want to argue on principle. Nah, what about rescue.rt, she asked. Another pause. We will evaluate, he said. The line went dead. Irina stared at the handset for a full minute, then put it down gently as if it might explode. Evaluate. The word meant time. Time was what people under ice did not have. The next morning, she received an email marked I-internal that told her the burst was ansa-likely interference C-auna and that she should avoid speculative interpretation.uww.r. The station did not get many emails marked I-internal. They were usually requests for data or reminders about maintenance schedules. This one felt like a hand on her mouth. She did not obey. She began to look for patterns. 2 days later, she found them. Faint pulses at low frequency, repeating in a way ice did not repeat. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short. Pause. Repeat. It was barely above the noise floor, the kind of signal a tired mind could imagine. But Irina had been tired enough months to trust numbers over feelings. She ran correlation filters until her screen filled with a thin line of certainty. a heartbeat. She forwarded the data to every address she had, including one in Murmansk she'd been told never to use. She attached a note that she wrote without embellishment. This is a distress pattern. Someone is alive. In Murmansk, in an office where the windows looked out on a city that still moved, a junior manager listened to a recorded pulse and felt his stomach turn. The Sevmorput had missed a checkpoint. That had been a communications issue hour for 48 hours, then a dock weather issue hour for another 48, because nobody wanted the words nuclear cargo ship and missing in the same sentence. By the time the official paperwork caught up to reality, rumor had already found its footing. Men in uniforms asked questions in corridors. Phones began to ring at strange hours. A meeting happened behind closed doors where no one mentioned responsibility, only containment. Under the ice, none of this existed. The Setmorpitange's survivors lived in a world measured by algae bubbles and filter resistance and the smell of damp socks. They did not know the beacon had screamed. They kept sending their acoustic heartbeat anyway, because a ritual you abandon becomes a superstition you regret. On day 149, Anya wrote in her ledger, COS 0.3%, sorbent cans 19, algae tanks 4 stable, 1 contaminated discarded, mushrooms 2 trays. We are smaller again. We sleep in shifts. People dream aloud. Dreaming aloud had become common. In the thickening air, the boundary between sleep and waking thinned. People woke convinced they heard footsteps in flooded compartments. One man insisted the ship was moving, that they were rising toward the surface. When he tried to open a door with red tape on it, Misha pinned him to the bulkhead without anger and held him there until Petrov arrived with a sedative. It's houses, the CO Ada, Petrov told Elena afterward. It makes the mind grab at stories. Elena looked at the pipes and pumps, the jury-rigged systems keeping him alive in a ship that wanted to become an object. Well, then we keep giving it better numbers, she said. Amana Sham stories. Outside, Irina thought stories of her own, that her data would be buried, that her station would be blamed, that she would be told, later, that nothing happened and she had misunderstood the sea. The Navy contact did call again, once. This time, the Manas's voice was colder. We have reviewed, he said. WIS station will not discuss this outside approved channels. He be not alive, Irina said, and she hated how her voice shook. Aus under ice, a distress pattern. If you delay chi. This could be a provocation, the man said, and now his words were sharp enough to cut. Do you understand what else is in that region? What else uses these techniques? Adieu. Irina's mouth went dry. She did understand. The Arctic was a chessboard with pieces that pretended not to be there. If I taught is a provocation, she said. As Yuri, strange one. I taught is a heartbeat. I taught you. There was another silence, and in that silence she heard something else, not uncertainty, but calculation. Your data is noted, the man said finally, as a stay at your post. .eca. After the call, Irina stared at the sea through a window crusted with frost. She imagined people in a steel box counting breaths and fighting mold and calling into water like prayer. 2 weeks later, the station's hydrophones recorded a new kind of noise, distant mechanical pulses that were not ice and not whales, propellers, a ship, then another, then the heavy, deliberate cracking of an icebreaker working its way toward a coordinate set that no one at the station was supposed to know. Irina sat alone at her console and listened to the approach of help that would never be described as help in any public report. Under the ice, the Sevmorputache's survivors heard it too. It came through steel as a faint, rhythmic thud, so low at first Anya thought it was her own pulse in her ears. Then it repeated with mechanical patience thud, 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 different from the icy's random groans. Misha stopped mid-step in the corridor and held up a hand. Do you hear that? I whispered. He whispered. Elena pressed her palm to the bulkhead and closed her eyes. The vibration was real. It had intention. Someone is out there, Enjifi, she said, and the words were both hope and warning. Dr. Petrovatian's face went blank with a new kind of fear. Then we have to survive long enough for them to reach us, Sanchi, he said. In the workshop, the algae tanks bubbled steadily, and for the first time in months, the sound did not feel lonely. Chapter 9, Extraction. When the drilling began overhead, it sounded like winter learning to speak in metal. The first day the vibrations came, they were faint, intermittent, easy to dismiss as ice grinding. By the third day, they formed a rhythm so regular it made Anya's skin prickle. Machines had arrived in the neighborhood of their grave. Elena ordered a listening watch, 2 people per shift, ear to bulkhead, recording times and intensities in the same ledger they used for COA. If the rescue team moved away, they would know. If the drilling stopped, they would know. Knowing was the only way to keep hope from becoming hysteria. On day 174 in Anya's count, not the calendar's. A new sound joined the drilling, a series of sharp taps against the hull, deliberate and close. Misha froze mid-step. His eyes went wet. "Daro's ahama," he said, voice cracking like a boyas's. Elena shoved past him to the nearest bulkhead and rapped back with a wrench. 3 short strikes, 1 long, 3 short. Their own heartbeat turned into metal. The tapping paused. Then came an answering pattern not the same, but structured, as if someone had looked up the code for hope. Kostya laughed, a ragged sound. They actually talking, he whispered. After that, the rescue became a negotiation between 2 worlds. Above, on the ice, engineers built a small city that was all equipment and urgency, heated tents, generators, winches, a drill rig that ate ice with hot water and teeth. Men in thick suits moved in lines between tasks, faces hidden by goggles, their breath white and constant. They argued over maps and sonar data. They argued over how to approach a nuclear ship without turning a rescue into an incident. Below, in the Sevmorpitas's damp corridors, Elena argued with physics and time. "They will cut," Misin Petrov said, watching the crew react to the tapping with the kind of fragile joy that made him nervous. "Afan, they will open something. We have to be ready for pressure changes, cold shock, infection. People will try to run .ecn." "Oh, no one runs," Elena said. Petrov looked at her. "You cannot order panic away .ey." Elena's voice softened, and that softness frightened Anya more than shouting would have. "Then we teach them what to do with it," Elena said. "Elena said a team on D. We give panic a job." They organized the crew into extraction groups based on health and usefulness. The injured first, the oldest first, then those whose lungs already sounded wrong. There was argument, of course. People always believed their need was specialists. But the argument never rose above conversation, because arguing loudly cost breath, and because Dr. Petrov stared down dissent like a man guarding a door to life. The first physical contact took another week. A rescue diver arrived at the wetlock hatch one afternoon like a creature from a different planet. His suit was newer, his lights brighter, his movements confident in a way that made Misha Hodge's shoulders tense with resentment. He flashed a hand signal through the glass inspection port, okay. Elena and Misha cycled the wetlock with ritualized care. The diver handed through a sealed package with a laminated note inside. The handwriting was blocky, hurried, and in Russian. "We have you. Do not exit unless directed. Prepare for dry transfer. Keep reactor at min power or scram on order. More instructions soon." Sokolov read it twice, then sat down hard on a bench. "They found us? Aye," he whispered, as if speaking it louder might break it. The diver returned 2 more times that day with supplies that felt obscene in their abundance. Fresh CO-Itameni sorbent canisters, medical oxygen cylinders, sealed food packs. Petrov handled the supplies like contraband, immediately inventorying, immediately rationing. We don't gorge, he told the crew. We don't celebrate by killing ourselves. Ed. Above, the rescue team stabilized the wreck as much as a wreck could be stabilized. They attached lines to keep it from shifting if the ice moved again. They monitored the reactor compartment with instruments lowered through the water column, watching for radiation spikes like men watching for ghosts. The political layer arrived before the extraction did. Anya heard it in the way the rescue divers began to speak through clenched teeth, and the way their instructions came with an extra sentence. Do not discuss cargo. Do not touch certain containers. Do not open cabinets without permission. Petrov, hearing those words, smiled without humor. Of course, Amaid, he said. The story matters more than the people. On day 186, the dry transfer system arrived. From the wetlock hatch, Anya watched the rescue team maneuver a pressurized capsule toward the shippa, an ugly cylinder with clamps and seals, a mechanical stomach that would swallow survivors and carry them upward without forcing them into the water. It was not elegant. It was mining equipment designed for flesh. The capsule locked onto the outer hatch with a dull, satisfying thud that vibrated through the stairwell. Pressure equalization happened slowly, gauges monitored by divers and by Elena, whose face had not relaxed in months. When the inner door of the capsule finally opened, warm air flowed into the stairwell, carrying a smell Anya had not expected: clean plastic, disinfectant, the sterile scent of a world that still had warehouses. Amanazi's voice came through the opening, muffled by equipment. Afayansi slow, ages bias, one at a time, sit, breathe, do not panic.eg. The first to go was Yuri, because his fingers had never fully recovered from the cold and because Petrov insisted compromised circulation would become a hospital crisis if left longer. Yuri sat inside the capsule like a child in a strange chair. A medic strapped him in, checked his pulse, shone a light into his eyes. Yuri began to cry, silently, the tears making clean tracks down his dirty face. Then the capsule door closed and the hatch sealed and the machinery outside pulled him away. The Sevmorput felt suddenly emptier, and the emptiness was a new kind of fear. They had lived so long as a closed system that the idea of being opened, of pieces being removed, felt like disassembly. Extraction became routine the way everything else had. Every day, 2 or 3 people left, sometimes 4. The capsule came and went like a tide. Those who remained behind watched the COEC meter drop for the first time in months as the population thinned. Relief was followed by guilt, because relief meant someone else had gone. On the 4th day of extractions, men in different suits arrived. They didn't come down themselves, they sent messages through the divers, they wanted inventories, they wanted to know what the crew had touched, they wanted the biohazard case. Petrov refused at first. Ascot and Kies locked, he said. It stays locked until everyone is out. The reply came back on a laminated note. SE secure the case immediately. Transfer under supervision. Do not discuss contents. Elena stared at the note, then at Petrov. If we fight them now, she said quietly, they can slow this down. Petrovich's mouth tightened. So we give them their toy? We give them the thing, Elena corrected. We keep the people, not Dian. They carried the biohazard case to the wet lock like pallbearers. Anya watched, heart hammering, as it disappeared into the capsule on Emetica's lap, guarded like a crown jewel. After it left, Pavel looked at Elena with hollow eyes. That wasn't afforestation, he whispered. Elena's gaze was flat. I know it, she said. I know it was none. The lab module container went next. Rescue divers moved through the upper hold with efficiency, attaching straps, rigging it for lift. They did it before the last people were out, and the order told Anya everything she needed to know about priorities. Sokolov watched it happen through a hatch window, his hands clenched. They will say it was my fault, he murmured. Petrovich's voice was sharp. They will say whatever makes the paperwork easiest. Na. When Anya Asa's turn came, she almost refused to leave without her ledger. Her notebook had become heavier than paper had any right to be. It held numbers that were their life, COH readings, sorbent counts, pump failures, names of the dead, dates of seal losses. It also held sentences that were not poetry but truth. We sealed the hatch on Sergei, we grew algae, we opened the case. She slid it under her shirt, against her skin, and taped it there with medical tape like a bandage over her heart. The capsule was warm. The medic inside smelled of soap. Anya sat in the chair and felt her body tremble, not from cold but from the sudden permission to stop bracing. As the capsule lifted away from the ship, she felt the Sevmorput recede like a pulled tooth. For a moment, she imagined the ship as a living thing, injured and stubborn, and wanted to apologize for leaving. The ascent was slow. Through a small porthole, she saw nothing but black water, then the underside of ice passing like the ceiling of a cave, then suddenly a pale circle of light as they reached the drilled shaft. It was not open sea. It was a tunnel lined with ice, slick and indifferent, cut by men and machines. When the capsule broke into the tented world above, the brightness punched her eyes. White light, real light, it made her dizzy. They helped her out onto a platform where ice had been turned into a floor. Wind hit her face like a slap. Above was not sky, exactly. Exactly another were tents and cables and the low silhouette of an icebreaker superstructure, but there was space. There was distance. There was air that did not smell of algae. Anya's knees buckled. Someone caught her. In the heated tent, they lined survivors up in blankets and made them drink warm liquids. Doctors asked questions and shone lights and wrote notes. Men with different badges asked different questions. What did you open? One of them asked Anya, and his voice was gentle in the way of someone trained to make people cooperate. Anya stared at him, slow to understand. Her mind was still inside steel. Adena, we opened what kept us alive, she said. He smiled thinly. We will discuss specifics later, he said. Even how, for now, focus on recovery, and please refrain from talking to anyone outside the medical team. HA. Outside the tent, engines idled. Helicopter rotors thumped in the distance like another heartbeat. Someone had brought cameras, but the cameras stayed pointed at ice and equipment, not at faces. That night, in a bunk on the icebreaker where the mattress was too soft, Anya woke to silence and felt panic because silence meant no fans, no pumps, no rules. She put a hand to her chest and felt the edge of her taped-down ledger. For the first time since the sinking, she allowed herself to believe a dangerous thought. We made it. Then she remembered Petrov Keish's words, eyes the paperwork easiest, and the thought curdled into something else. We made it out, she corrected in the dark. Now we have to make it true. Chapter 10, Ledger. In the hospital, the ceiling was too high. Anya lay in a bed that smelled of bleach and clean cotton and listened to the absence of machinery, no fan hum, no pump thump, no distant groan of steel adjusting to pressure, just quiet, broken by the occasional squeak of a cartwheel in the corridor. The quiet felt wrong. Her body kept expecting the rules of the ship. It expected the air to thicken if she breathed too fast. It expected every light to be rationed. It expected that if she spoke too loudly, someone would remind her that sound and anger were expensive. She counted breaths anyway. In for 4, out for 6. Her fingers moved on the blanket as if tallying. In the first week after extraction, they were treated like victims in the medical sense. Warmed, fed, monitored, questioned about frostbite and lung function and infection. Dr. Petrov fought for their activity limits as if they were still under ice. Slow 10,000 hei, he told nurses. You do not refill a closed system by flooding it. The nurses smiled politely and did what they could. The outside world had its own procedures. It did not always respect survival logic learned in a steel box. Elena visited Anya on the 3rd day, moving carefully as if her joints were unsure what gravity meant without a tilt. Her hair had been cut short during their months under icy practical, sanitary, and now it made her look younger than her eyes did. How was your head? Elena asked. Too loud, Anya said. Elena nodded as if that made sense. The ray pulling the story apart, Maishi said. Anya's throat tightened. What story? What story? Elena looked toward the door. The story that keeps them safe, she said. She said, not the one that keeps us human, Alani. The debriefings began once the doctors declared them stable enough to answer questions without fainting. They took place in a room with a table that was too clean and chairs that were too soft. Men in uniforms sat with folders. Men without uniforms sat with laptops. A woman with an interpreter's and calm eyes offered tea that no one drank. The questions were not the ones Anya expected. How long were you without communications? When did you bring the reactor back to low power? Who authorized opening the lab container? Not ID. Describe the contents of the biohazard case. Anya answered what she could. Elena answered what she must. Dr. Petrov answered with anger that he tried to keep wrapped in professionalism. Captain Sokolov sat at the end of the table like a man already sentenced. He looked older every day, as if the outside world had resumed its habit of taking years and weeks. At the end of one session, a man with a careful smile slid a document toward them. This is standard, Nonzaha, he said. Osti non-disclosure, operational details, cargo specifics, for your protection and for national security. UFI. Elena read it once and pushed it back. It's for your protection, she said. The Menanza smile did not change. You have been through trauma, he said. Ifana Mazal, he said. Public attention will not help you heal. Ifana. Dr. Petrovation's laugh was small and ugly. Alcha public attention is not what worries you, he said. The Menan's eyes flicked to Petrovis, and for a moment the smile slipped. A doctor, Asian doctor, he said softly. A consequences for spreading incomplete information. Asian die. Petrovation's hands clenched on the table edge. Incomplete, he repeated. We were under ice for months. We rationed air. We sealed doors on people. We reopened a reactor on the seabed. You want to call that incomplete? In? The woman with calm eyes spoke for the first time. We want to call it classified, she said. After that, they were separated. Elena received a private offer in a corridor, cooperation, silence, a job after recovery. She declined without raising her voice. The offer was repeated with different words. She declined again. Petrovation's medical license was threatened without being threatened. IIA review, when just someone said. I, concern. He began to speak even more carefully, which in Petrovash's case meant his eyes grew colder. Sokolov signed. He signed in a room without Elena and Petrov, his hand shaking. He told himself it was to keep the survivors from being punished for doing what they had to do. He told himself it was to keep the rescue effort from being delayed further by scandal. He told himself it was to protect his family from a story that would eat them. Anya watched him sign and understood that the Captainian's last act of command was surrender. That night, she took the ledger out from under the mattress where she'd been hiding it like contraband and opened it on her knees. The pages were warped from humidity, corners stained with algae fingerprints and rust. The handwriting was small, cramped, written in the dark by red emergency light. Numbers marched down the paper like soldiers. Who was coined to 1.1%? COS quet? Seal lost. Corridor C4. Date. Sergei Vasilyev, sealed beyond wet lock. Date. Biohazard case opened. Vial code, coned. It was not a story that made you feel brave. It was a story that made you feel cold. Anya took her phone and it returned to her with the rest of her personal effects after someone decided it was no longer evidence, and photographed every page. She did it methodically, like wiring a panel. Flash off to avoid glare, frame steady, check focus. When she was done, she sent the images to 3 places. Her mother, with a message that simply said, "This is what happened." Irina Smirnovaya station email, which Elena had written down for her after a whispered conversation in a hospital hallway, and an address Pavel claimed belonged to a journalist who still answered anonymous tips. She expected alarms. She expected men to burst into her room. She expected her phone to be taken. Nothing happened that night. The outside world did not move as fast as panic. It moved as fast as bureaucracy. A week later, Elena appeared at Anya's bedside with a bruised expression and a folded pamphlet in her hand. "They have released a statement," Elena mouthed, "because there was a nurse in the room." When the nurse left, Elena handed her the pamphlet. It was a public announcement printed on cheap paper, the kind you saw taped to bulletin boards. Incident involving vessel in Arctic waters. Crew evacuated. No radiation release. Investigation underway. No mention of months. No mention of the seabed. No mention of the dead. Anya felt something inside her go very still. "Avicii evacuated Mu," she whispered. "Like we stepped off a bus. Yushi." Elena's eyes flashed. "They want it neat," she said. "They want it fast. They want it fast. They want it forgettable." Petrov arrived later with his own paper round, an internal memo someone had mistakenly left where he could see it. He dropped it on the bed like a dirty instrument. "They isness sentimental filt. The biohazard case experimental filtration media," he said. "The Ishine rewriting the manifest. Ishine." Pavel, when he came, looked like a man who had discovered that even surviving didn't make you powerful. "They Avita retrieving everything from the wreck," Asata, he said quietly. "Asata not to save it, to control it. Asata." Sokolov didn't mind to visit again. Word came through nurses that he'd been moved to a separate facility and for observation. The phrase tasted like a door being closed. Anya kept counting breaths. 2 months after extraction, Elena and Petrov were summoned to a formal inquiry in a government building with marble floors. Anya was called as a AA supporting witness. They were escorted through hallways that smelled of wax and old authority. A clerk with a bored face handed them badges that read, "Visitor." In the hearing room, microphones waited on the table like traps. An official read from prepared notes in a voice that made tragedy sound administrative. He praised the swift response. He praised the professionalism of the rescue. He praised the resilience of the crew. He used the word agian sedente, the way someone used a napkin to blot blood. When Elena spoke, she spoke plainly. "We were under ice," she said, "on the seabed, for months. The ship became a habitat. We rationed air and power and food. We lost people. We made biological systems because chemical scrubbers are finite." The official liege's face did not change. "Certain operational details are not relevant," he said. Dr. Petrov leaned forward. "They are the only relevant details," he said. The official next tightened. "Well tightened, you are straying into classified areas. You now." Petrovasian's smile was sharp. "Eating breathing is not classified," he said. "Eating, he said, it is universal. Ni." They tried to steer the questions away from the time under ice and toward anything that could be framed as enter procedure. Long. They asked about the decision to bring the reactor to low power as if it were the true scandal. They asked about cargo as if cargo were a person. When it was Anya's turn, she felt her throat constrict. The room was warm, there were so many people, so much air, she could not make her body believe it. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook. The clerk's eyes widened. Yokananya. Anya opened it on the table. The pages lay flat with stubbornness. "This is our air Alpha," she said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "This is the shippiness life. These numbers are what kept us from killing each other, and what kept us from dying quietly. Et." The official leaned forward, and for the first time his calm looked like irritation. "All that document may contain sensitive information," he said. Anya looked at him and thought of red tape lines across doors, of a hatch wheel turning under her hands, of the hiss of a failing seal. "It contains breathing," she said. Petrovasian's hand covered the edge of the ledger protectively, like a doctor covering a wound. Elena's eyes met Anya's and held. The official Anna's voice cooled. "This will be reviewed," he said. Anya nodded. "It already has been, Anaya," she said, and did not elaborate. After the hearing, nothing immediate happened. No one arrested her in the hallway. No one dragged Elena away. Bureaucracy did not like drama. But the next day, Irina Smirnovayan's station posted an innocuous scientific bulletin online about anomalous anthropogenic acoustic signatures under late-season pack ice. .ada. The bulletin included a graph with a faint heartbeat pattern and a brief note about the difficulty of rescue operations. The journalist Pavel had published a story with blurred faces and a headline that avoided the words nuclear and ship as if they were contagious. The article's core was not accusation. It was quotation, COR 1.3%, seal lost, Sergei Vasiliev. The story began to leak into the world the way water leaked into a ship, slowly at first, then through every weak seam. In her hospital bed, Anya watched it happen on a screen and felt her chest loosen in a way she didn't mighty recognize at first. Not joy, not victory, something like pressure equalizing. Elena came by that evening with 2 coffees and set one on Anya's tray without asking. "You sent it out," Elena said. Anya nodded. Her hands were trembling. "I was afraid," she admitted. Elena sipped her coffee and looked out the window at a city street where people walked without thinking about air. Good, she said. Ichieshi, she said. Sidieshie. Anya stared at the foam lid on the cup, at the steam rising freely into a room that would never suffocate. No, do you think it will matter? Dayushi asked. Elena didn't answer immediately. Outside, a snowplow scraped along the road with a sound that made Anya's spine flinch and steel on ice, a familiar violence. Finally, Elena said, "It mattered to us, Ete." Anya took a careful breath and did not count it.